Master word list. Words starting with letter F. Fabricate means build. For example, if we fabricate the buildings in this project out of standardized sections, we can reduce construction costs considerably. Facade means front of building or false appearance. For example, the ornate facade of the church was often photographed by tourists who never bothered to walk around the building to view its other sides. Facet means small plane surface. For example, the stonecutter decided to improve the rough diamond by providing it with several facets. Facetious means joking, humorous. For example, I'm serious about this project. I don't need any facetious, smart-alecky cracks about do-gooder little rich girls. Facile means easily accomplished. For example, words came easily to Jonathan. He was a facile speaker and prided himself on being ready to make a speech at a moment's notice. Facilitate means help bring about. For example, rest and proper nourishment should facilitate the patient's recovery. Facsimile means copy. For example, many museums sell facsimiles of the works of art on display. Faction means party, clique, dissension. For example, the quarrels and bickering of the two small factions within the club disturbed the majority of the members. Faculty means teaching staff. For example, as he grew old, Professor Twigley feared he might lose his faculties and become unfit to teach. Fallacious means false, misleading. For example, paradoxically, fallacious reasoning does not always yield erroneous results. Even though your logic may be faulty, the answer you get may nevertheless be correct. Fallible means liable to err. For example, I know I am fallible, but I feel confident that I am right this time. Fallow means uncultivated. For example, farmers have learned that it is advisable to permit land to lie fallow every few years. Falter means hesitate. For example, when told to dive off the high board, she did not falter, but proceeded at once. Fanaticism means excessive zeal. For example, when Islamic fundamentalists demanded the death of Salman Rushdie because his novel questioned their faith, world opinion condemned them for their fanaticism. Fancy means notion, whim, inclination. For example, Martin took a fancy to paint his toenails purple. Assuming he would outgrow such fanciful behavior, his parents ignored his fancy feet. Fanfare means call by bugles or trumpets. For example, the exposition was opened with a fanfare of trumpets and the firing of cannon. Farce means broad comedy, mockery. For example, nothing went right. The entire interview degenerated into a farce. Fastidious means difficult to please. For example, Bobby was such a fastidious eater that he would eat a sandwich only if his mother first cut off every scrap of crust. Fatalism means belief that events are determined by forces beyond one's control. For example, with fatalism, he accepted the hardships that beset him. Fathom means comprehend, investigate. For example, I find his motives impossible to fathom. In fact, I'm totally clueless about what goes on in his mind. Fatuous means foolish. For example, he is far too intelligent to utter such fatuous remarks. Fauna means animals of a period or region. For example, the scientist could visualize the fauna of the period by examining the skeletal remains and the fossils. Fawning means courting favor by flattering. For example, she was constantly surrounded by a group of fawning admirers who hoped to win some favor. Phase means disconcert, dismay. For example, no crisis could faze the resourceful hotel manager. Feasible means practical. For example, is it feasible to build a new stadium for the Yankees on New York's West Side? Without additional funding, the project is clearly unrealistic. Fecundity means fertility, fruitfulness. For example, the fecundity of his mind is illustrated by the many vivid images in his poems. Feign means pretend. For example, Lady Macbeth feigned illness although she was actually healthy. Feint means trick, shift. For example, the boxer was fooled by his opponent's feint and dropped his guard. Felicitous means suitably expressed, well chosen. For example, he was famous for his felicitous remarks and was called upon to serve as master of ceremonies at many a banquet. Felicity means happiness, appropriateness. For example, she wrote a note to the newlyweds wishing them great felicity in their wedded life. Fell means cruel, deadly. For example, the newspapers told of the tragic spread of the fell disease. Fell means cut or knock down, bring down. For example, crying timber. Paul Bunyan felled the mighty redwood tree. Robin Hood loosed his arrow and felled the king's deer. Felon means person convicted of a grave crime. For example, a convicted felon loses the right to vote. Feral means not domestic, wild. For example, abandoned by their owners, dogs may revert to their feral state, roaming the woods in packs. Ferment means agitation, commotion. For example, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, much of Eastern Europe was in a state of ferment. Ferret means drive or hunt out of hiding. For example, she ferreted out their secret. Fervent means ardent, hot. For example, she felt that the fervent praise was excessive and somewhat undeserved. Fervid means ardent. For example, her fervid enthusiasm inspired all of us to undertake the dangerous mission. Fester means rankle, produce irritation or resentment. For example, Joe's insult festered in Anne's mind for days, and made her too angry to speak to him. Festive means joyous, celebratory. For example, their wedding in the park was a festive occasion. Fetid means malodorous. For example, the neglected wound became fetid. Fetter means shackle. For example, the prisoner was fettered to the wall. Fiasco means total failure. For example, our ambitious venture ended in a fiasco and we were forced to flee. Fickle means changeable, faithless. For example, as soon as Romeo saw Juliet, he forgot all about his old girlfriend Rosalind. Was Romeo fickle? Fictitious means imaginary. For example, although this book purports to be a biography of George Washington, many of the incidents are fictitious. Fidelity means loyalty. For example, a dog's fidelity to its owner is one of the reasons why that animal is a favorite household pet. Figment means invention, imaginary thing. For example, that incident never took place. It is a figment of your imagination. Figurative means not literal, but metaphorical. For example, to lose one's marbles is a figurative expression. If you're told that Jack has lost his marbles, no one expects you to rush out to buy him a replacement set. Figurine means small ornamental statuette. For example, in The Maltese Falcon, Sam Spade was hired to trace the missing figurine of a black bird. Filament means fine thread or fiber. For example, a ray of sunlight illuminated the filaments of the spider web, turning the web into a net of gold. Filch means steal. For example, the boys filched apples from the fruit stand. Filial means pertaining to a son or daughter. For example, many children forget their filial obligations and disregard the wishes of their parents. Filibuster means to block legislation by making long speeches. For example, even though we disapproved of Senator Foghorn's political goals, we were impressed by his ability to filibuster endlessly to keep an issue from coming to a vote. Finale means conclusion. For example, it is not until we reach the finale of this play that we can understand the author's message. Finesse means delicate skill. For example, the finesse and adroitness with which the surgeon wielded her scalpel impressed all the observers in the operating room. Finicky means too particular, fussy. For example, a little girl was finicky about her food, leaving over anything that wasn't to her taste. Firebrand means hothead, troublemaker. For example, the police tried to keep track of all the local firebrands when the president came to town. Fissure means crevice. For example, the mountain climbers secured footholds in tiny fissures in the rock. Fitful means spasmodic, intermittent. For example, after several fitful attempts, he decided to postpone the start of the project until he felt more energetic. Flabbergasted means astonished, overcome with surprise. For example, in the film Flubber, the hero invents a remarkable substance whose amazing properties leave his co-workers flabbergasted. Flaccid means flabby. For example, his sedentary life had left him with flaccid muscles. Flag means droop, grow feeble. For example, when the opposing hockey team scored its third goal only minutes into the first quarter, the home team's spirits flagged. Flagrant means conspicuously wicked, blatant, outrageous. For example, the governor's appointment of his brother-in-law to the state Supreme Court was a flagrant violation of the state laws against nepotism. Flair means talent. For example, she has an uncanny flair for discovering new artists before the public has become aware of their existence. Flamboyant means ornate. For example, modern architecture has discarded the flamboyant trimming on buildings and emphasizes simplicity of line. Flaunt means display ostentatiously. For example, Mae West saw nothing wrong with showing off her considerable physical charms, saying, "Honey, if you've got it, flaunt it." Fleck means spot. For example, her cheeks, flecked with tears, were testimony to the hours of weeping. Fledgling means inexperienced. For example, while it is necessary to provide these fledgling poets with an opportunity to present their work, it is not essential that we admire everything they write. Fleece means wool coat of a sheep. For example, they shear sheep of their fleece, which they then comb into separate strands of wool. Fleece means rob, plunder. For example, the tricksters fleeced him of his inheritance. Flick means light stroke as with a whip. For example, the horse needed no encouragement. One flick of the whip was all the jockey had to apply to get the animal to run at top speed. Flinch means hesitate, shrink. For example, he did not flinch in the face of danger but fought back bravely. Flippant means lacking proper seriousness. For example, when Mark told Mona he loved her, she dismissed his earnest declaration with a flippant, "Oh, you say that to all the girls." Flit means fly, dart lightly, pass swiftly by. For example, like a bee flitting from flower to flower, Rose flitted from one boyfriend to the next. Flow means mass of floating ice. For example, the ship made slow progress as it battered its way through the ice floes. Flora means plants of a region or era. For example, because she was a botanist, she spent most of her time studying the flora of the desert. Florid means ruddy, reddish, flowery. For example, if you go to Florida and get a sunburn, your complexion will look florid. Flounder means struggle and thrash about. For example, up to his knees in the bog, Floyd floundered about, trying to regain his footing. Flourish means grow well, prosper. For example, the orange trees flourished in the sun. Flout means reject, mock. For example, the headstrong youth flouted all authority, he refused to be curbed. Fluctuate means waver, shift. For example, the water pressure in our shower fluctuates wildly. You start rinsing yourself off with a trickle, and 2 minutes later, a blast of water nearly knocks you down. Fluency, for example, means smoothness of speech. He spoke French with fluency and ease. Fluke means unlikely occurrence, stroke of fortune. For example, when Douglas defeated Tyson for the heavyweight championship, some sportscasters dismissed his victory as a fluke. Fluster means confuse. For example, the teacher's sudden question flustered him and he stammered his reply. Flux means flowing, series of changes. For example, while conditions are in such a state of flux, I do not wish to commit myself too deeply in this affair. Fodder means coarse food for cattle, horses. For example, one of Nancy's chores at the ranch was to put fresh supplies of fodder in the horses' stalls. Foible means weakness, slight fault. For example, we can overlook the foibles of our friends. No one is perfect. Foil means contrast. For example, in Star Wars, dark, evil Darth Vader is a perfect foil for fair-haired, naive Luke Skywalker. Foil means defeat, frustrate. For example, in the end, Skywalker is able to foil Vader's diabolical schemes. Foliage means masses of leaves. For example, every autumn before the leaves fell he promised himself he would drive through New England to admire the colorful fall foliage. Foment means stir up, instigate. For example, Cheryl's archenemy Heather spread some nasty rumors that fomented trouble in the club. Do you think Cheryl's foe meant to foment such discord? Foolhardy means rash. For example, don't be foolhardy. Get the advice of experienced people before undertaking this venture. Fop means man excessively concerned with his clothes. For example, people who dismissed young Mizrahi as a fop felt chagrined when he turned into one of the top fashion designers of his day. Forbearance means patience. For example, we must use forbearance in dealing with him because he is still weak from his illness. Ford means place where a river can be crossed on foot. For example, rather than risk using the shaky rope bridge, David walked a half-mile downstream until he came to the nearest ford. Forebears means ancestors. For example, reverence for one's forebears plays an important part in many Oriental cultures. Foreboding means premonition of evil. For example, suspecting no conspiracies against him, Caesar gently ridiculed his wife's forebodings about the Ides of March. Forensic means suitable to debate or courts of law. For example, in her best forensic manner, the lawyer addressed the jury. Foreshadow means give an indication beforehand. For example, in retrospect, political analysts realized that Yeltsin's defiance of the attempted coup foreshadowed his emergence as the dominant figure of the new Russian Republic. Foresight means ability to foresee future happenings. For example, a wise investor, she had the foresight to buy land just before the current real estate boom. Forestall means prevent by taking action in advance. For example, by setting up a prenuptial agreement, the prospective bride and groom hope to forestall any potential arguments about money in the event of a divorce. Forego means give up, do without. For example, determined to lose weight for the summer, Ida decided to forego dessert until she could fit into a size 8 again. Forlorn means sad and lonely, wretched. For example, deserted by her big sisters and her friends, the forlorn child sat sadly on the steps awaiting their return. Formality means ceremonious quality. For example, the president received the visiting heads of state with due formality, flags waving, honor guards standing at attention, anthems sounding at full blast. Formidable means menacing, threatening. For example, we must not treat the battle lightly, for we are facing a formidable foe. Forsake means desert, abandon, renounce. For example, no one expected Foster to forsake his wife and children and run off with another woman. Forswear means renounce, abandon. For example, the captured knight could escape death only if he agreed to forswear Christianity and embrace Islam as the one true faith. Forte means strong point or special talent. For example, I am not eager to play this rather serious role, for my forte is comedy. Forthright means outspoken, straightforward, frank. For example, never afraid to call a spade, she was perhaps too forthright to be a successful party politician. Fortitude means bravery, courage. For example, he was awarded the medal for his fortitude in the battle. Fortuitous means accidental, by chance. For example, though he pretended their encounter was fortuitous, he'd actually been hanging around her usual haunts for the past 2 weeks, hoping she'd turn up. Forum means place of assembly to discuss public concerns. For example, the film opens with a shot of the ancient Forum in Rome, where several senators are discussing the strange new sect known as Christians. Foster means rear, encourage. For example, according to the legend, Romulus and Remus were fostered by a she-wolf who raised the abandoned infants with her own cubs. Founder means fail completely, sink. For example, after hitting the submerged iceberg, the Titanic started taking in water rapidly and soon foundered. Founder means person who establishes. For example, among those drowned when the Titanic sank was the founder of the Abraham and Straus department store. Fracas means brawl. For example, the military police stopped the fracas in the bar and arrested the belligerents. Fractious means unruly, disobedient, irritable. For example, bucking and kicking, the fractious horse unseated its rider. Frail means weak. For example, the delicate child seemed too frail to lift the heavy carton. Franchise means business license to sell a product. For example, the city issued a franchise to the company to operate surface transit lines on the streets for 99 years. Frantic means wild, distraught as from fear or worry. For example, at the time of the collision, many people became frantic with fear. Fraternize means associate in a friendly way. For example, after the game, the members of the two teams fraternized as cheerfully as if they had never been rivals. Fraudulent means cheating, deceitful. For example, the government seeks to prevent fraudulent and misleading advertising. Fraught means filled. For example, since this enterprise is fraught with danger, I will ask for volunteers who are willing to assume the risks. Fray means brawl. For example, the Three Musketeers were in the thick of the fray. Frenetic means frenzied, frantic. For example, his frenetic activities convinced us that he had no organized plan of operation. Frenzied means madly excited. For example, as soon as they smelled smoke, the frenzied animals milled about in their cages. Fresco means painting on plaster. For example, the cathedral is visited by many tourists who wish to admire the frescoes by Giotto. Fret means to be annoyed or vexed. For example, to fret over your poor grades is foolish. Instead, decide to work harder in the future. Friction means clash in opinion, rubbing against. For example, at this time when harmony is essential, we cannot afford to have any friction in our group. Frigid means intensely cold. For example, Alaska is in the frigid zone. Frivolous means lacking in seriousness. For example, though Nancy enjoyed Bill's frivolous, light-hearted companionship, she sometimes wondered whether he could ever be serious. Frolicsome means prankish. For example, the frolicsome puppy tried to lick the face of its master. Frond means fern leaf, palm or banana leaf. For example, after the storm the beach was littered with the fronds of palm trees. Frugality means thrift. For example, in economically hard times, anyone who doesn't learn to practice frugality risks bankruptcy. Fruition means bearing of fruit, fulfillment, realization. For example, this building marks the fruition of all our aspirations and years of hard work. Frustrate means thwart, defeat. For example, we must frustrate this dictator's plan to seize control of the government. Fugitive means fleeting or transitory. For example, the film brought a few fugitive images to her mind, but on the whole it made no lasting impression upon her. Fulcrum means support on which a lever rests. For example, if we use this stone as a fulcrum and the crowbar as a lever, we may be able to move this boulder. Fulsome means disgustingly excessive. For example, his fulsome praise of the dictator revolted his listeners. Fundamental means basic, primary, essential. For example, the committee discussed all sorts of side issues without ever getting down to addressing the fundamental problem. Furlough means leave of absence. For example, dreaming of her loved ones back in the States, the young soldier could hardly wait for her upcoming furlough. Furor means frenzy, great excitement. For example, the story of her embezzlement of the funds created a furor on the stock exchange. Furtive means stealthy, sneaky. For example, noticing the furtive glance the customer gave the diamond bracelet on the counter, the jeweler wondered whether he had a potential shoplifter on his hands. Fusion means union, coalition. For example, the opponents of the political party in power organized a fusion of disgruntled groups and became an important element in the election. Futile means useless, hopeless, ineffectual. For example, it is futile for me to try to get any work done around here while the telephone is ringing every 30 seconds. End of the word list with words starting with letter F.